Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IMechE 5 Tips to Reduce Stress, Raise Your Energy and Improve Your Mental Wellbeing webinar. My name is Rob Austin-Goodall. I'll be moderating this webinar delivered by my colleague Sally. Thank you for all those who have turned up and used the chat box. For those who have arrived recently, please use the chat box for any questions you have throughout the webinar. And if you haven't got that open, that can be found on a tab on the right-hand side of the screen saying chat. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to my colleague Sally, who will kick off the webinar. Sally.
Thank you very much, Rob, and a very big warm welcome from me to this 5 tips to reduce stress, raise your energy and improve your mental well-being. Absolutely delighted to be with you today. Now, a brief introduction about myself before we really get into the detail of our content this afternoon. My name is Sally Desborough and I run my own business, Your Wellbeing Hub, designing, developing and delivering mental health and wellbeing workshops, as well as mental health first aid training programs. I have a working background in HR that started back in 2008, and I started the transition into the mental health and wellbeing space in 2017. After personal experience of mental illness in 2016. And that was really the driving force for me, wanting to do more, wanting to raise awareness about mental health and mental health issues, encourage proactive management of mental health to prevent issues from arising, encourage supportive mental health conversations when needed, and also really drive home the message that anyone can be affected by a mental health issue at any point in time. I left the corporate HR world in 2019 to commit my full time to running different mental health training programs and workshops. And I have experience working with organisations across various industries, from engineering to advertising and construction to professional services. So for our agenda today, we are going to have a look, first of all, at how mental health is defined and why our mental health is so important. I think it's a great place to start in terms of contextualising this topic. So I'm looking forward to sharing that content with you. We will then move through to look at stress. This is a webinar about how we can reduce stress. So we'll look at stress, defining stress, look at some stress management tools as well to be able to help ourselves. And hopefully you can have some key takeaways from those in terms of how we manage our stress. And then towards the end, we'll close on 5 top tips to reduce stress, raise our energy and improve our mental well-being. Okay, so what is mental health then? Now, mental health is a very relevant topic that a lot of us are talking about at the moment. We know the impacts of the last year have been profound for many. So it certainly moved up the agenda for a lot of us, for individuals and organisations. And additionally, particularly in the UK this week, there's been a particular focus as it is Mental Health Awareness Week. And hopefully these conversations will continue to go on and on and on. Now, the term mental health can evoke a lot of thoughts for people. It can evoke thoughts of happiness, sadness, people feeling stressed or anxious, maybe grief. But there are various definitions of mental health, and the term mental health can be quite confusing. So I'd like to share a couple of these definitions with you to contextualise today's session. So what is mental health? Now, mental health includes our emotional, psychological and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel and behave. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others and make choices. Being mentally healthy doesn't just mean that you don't have a mental health problem. If you're in good mental health, you can make the most of your potential, cope with life and play a full part in your family, workplace, community and among friends. The mental health isn't about whether we have a mental health issue or not. It's a broad term that covers how we think, feel and behave and how that can change, but also how we engage with the world and everyday life, and the quality of our mental health will impact whether we are able to engage and bring our full selves to the everyday. Now, the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So the World Health Organization is telling us that mental health can be positive. Now, it's not always going to be positive. It would be unrealistic at all points in our lives to expect positive mental health, but absolutely mental health can be positive. And certainly historically, when we've talked about mental health, people have jumped to mental illness or some kind of issue like stress, anxiety, or depression, rather than thinking of mental health as a broad spectrum that ranges anywhere from positive mental health to poor mental health and anywhere that sits between that. And mental health is everybody's business because we all have mental health. Now, as I just mentioned, we all have mental health, and we can consider that mental health sits on a scale, and we all sit on it somewhere. We can experience positive mental health through to poor mental health and anything in between. And for ourselves, from time to time, we might like to reflect on where we think we are sitting. And our mental health is fluid, it's changeable, it's not going to stay in one position. And as we go through our lives, we do go through difficult experiences, and we can expect our mental health to shift and change. Now, so far, I've not really mentioned anything about mental illness. Sometimes there can be an assumption that for someone with a diagnosed mental illness or condition will automatically be experiencing poor mental health and sit down the lower end of the scale, but that is not the case at all. Someone with a condition could experience positive mental health where they are able to deal with the day-to-day, they are able to contribute to family, friends and society, and are able to fulfill their potential. And equally, someone may not have a diagnosis, but experience poor mental health, where they might find it difficult to engage with work, with relationships, with the day-to-day. So what that means is mental health and mental illness are not the opposite of one another. Mental illness takes a medical view of a diagnosed condition, and mental health is a social view about how we can engage with our day-to-day lives. And we know that there is stigma associated with talking about mental health. And the thing is, our mental health can be good and it can be positive. So why such a stigma? Well, really, it's going to be down to the historical belief systems and attitudes that still feed into society today. Now, there are various questions that we can use to measure the quality of our mental health. And again, we can engage with those to consider where we are at, where we might change. So how do I think, feel and behave? So if I'm thinking positively, I'll probably feel quite positive and optimistic. I'll probably feel quite content. So that might impact my behaviours. I feel sociable. I can engage with the day-to-day. I can tackle issues head on. But equally, there might be times where I think quite negatively and I feel negative and pessimistic. And that might cause my mood to become lower and change. And so behaviourally, I might not want to engage because I'm feeling low. I don't feel so sociable. I'm going to be withdrawn and take a step back, and I might focus more on problems than solutions. So that might be an indicator of where I am sitting on this scale by asking myself how I think, feel and behave. How do I cope with the ups and downs of everyday life? How I feel about myself and my life? How I see myself and my future? So again, if I'm experiencing poor mental health, I might have little hope or no hope for the future. How do I deal with negative things that happen? How does stress affect me? So if I'm experiencing positive mental health, I'm likely to feel resilient, that I can face into things. But if I'm experiencing poor mental health, I might feel overwhelmed much more quickly. How do I bounce back from setbacks? Can I focus, study, concentrate? And what does my self-confidence and self-esteem look like? So in poor mental health, someone's likely to experience quite a knock to their self-confidence and self-esteem. So again, we can ask ourselves these questions, very personally, where do I feel I'm at? And if we do that on a regular basis, we can start to notice those shifts and changes. We might notice what might cause us to experience a poorer mental health. And if we can identify those earlier on, we can put those mechanisms in place to support ourselves getting back up to positive mental health. Now, I'd like to move on to talk about the 8 dimensions of wellness. all of which are intrinsically linked with one another. Now, within these 8 dimensions, we have emotional wellness, physical wellness, social, financial, and spiritual. We also have environmental, intellectual, and occupational wellness. Maintaining an optimal level of wellness is absolutely crucial to living a higher quality life. Wellness matters, and it matters because everything we do and every emotion we feel relates to our overall well-being and mental health. And actually, some people use the term well-being and mental health interchangeably, one and the same thing. And in turn, our overall well-being or mental health directly affects our actions and emotions. So it's an ongoing circle. Therefore, it's important for everyone to achieve optimal wellness in order to subdue stress, reduce the risk of illness, and ensure positive interactions. Now, emotional wellness here is defined as an ability to cope effectively with life and build satisfying relationships with others. It's the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your feelings in a healthy way. It's learning to cope with life's stresses and challenges. And this will, of course, be closely linked with other dimensions of wellness as well. Now, we know that good physical wellness or good physical health improves our emotional wellness, and that positive emotional wellness improves our physical health and physical wellness. Poor financial wellness, as an example, can negatively impact our emotional, occupational, social, and physical wellness. And we know that our social wellness has significantly changed in the last year or so, and we've had to be distant from one another. That has caused people to feel lonely, isolated, disconnected. And for that reason, a lot of people have seen a decline in their emotional wellness and sense of overall well-being. So it is important to be intentional in addressing all of the dimensions and not necessarily prioritizing one over another. Now, there is no health without mental health. We are constantly using our mental health when we are working, learning, having conversations, enjoying relationships, absorbing information. And that is why it's so important that we look after it. Our mental health is used in our everyday. And by proactively looking after these 8 dimensions that contribute to our well-being, we are going to look after our mental health. It's absolutely necessary to support ourselves and support others if there is an issue. Our mental health is vital to our everyday. Now, moving on, let's consider stress. So today's webinar is about how we can reduce stress. So there is a must to discuss what stress is first of all. Now, generally, when we talk about stress, we tend to think of bad stress. So commonly, when I ask people, what is stress? What does this mean to you? A lot of people respond with feeling pressure, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like I can't focus because I've got so much on. We rarely say, I'm feeling stressed, isn't this great? Now, we can feel good stress, which is the stress that we feel when we are excited. Yes, we get a stress response, but there isn't a threat or fear. So we might experience this when we ride a roller coaster, if we're going for a promotion, or when we go on a first date or something like that. There's lots of triggers for good stress, and it keeps us feeling excited. It keeps us feeling alive. But of course, we can experience bad stress as well, in inverted commas, bad stress, when things come along that need a response, and the triggers in this case aren't always happy and exciting. That might be when we have our work scheduled for the day and something last minute comes up or something urgent lands on our desk and we have to deal with that there and then, or the car breaks down on the way to work or whatever that might be. Now, usually once that stress is dealt with, we can normally find a way to relax quickly to return to a happy and healthy state. Of course, we may also repeatedly face stresses that can take a heavy toll. So a stressful job, unhappy home life, financial instability, and this can lead to long-term or chronic stress, which our bodies aren't designed for and can have negative health consequences. Now, we can experience good stress. However, most people think of stress as that emotional strain we experience to adversity or the demands of our environment. Now, there is good news. We can turn some bad stress, not all bad stress, but some bad stress into good stress. And we'll look at that later on in the session. Now, moving on, I would like to introduce you to the first model that talks about mental health and stress and the relationship between those two things. And that's the stress container model. Now, the stress container model is a model that helps to explain why some people experience mental health issues and others not. And whilst we can have good stress, this model considers that emotional strain or the bad stress more so and its potential impacts. In this model, there is a strong relationship between vulnerability and stress. So let's consider two people. Let's consider Bob and Frank, both of whom are experiencing the exact same levels of stress. Bob is thriving, flourishing, and relishing in the challenge. Frank's experience, however, is vastly different. He feels like he can't cope. He's struggling to sleep, finding it difficult to make decisions. He's experiencing a suppressed appetite. He's feeling angry and irritable. So the same amount of stress, but a completely different reaction. And that is likely to be down to the difference in their levels of vulnerability. Now, vulnerability comes from a mix and blend of factors that influence our mental health in both a positive way and a negative way. Now, in this example, Bob is coping well. So he's likely to have more factors in his life that support his mental health, like having strong relationships, coping skills, communication skills, physical activity, nutrition, rest, and so on, making his stress container bigger, meaning he feels he can cope more with the stresses he's dealing with. Whereas Frank is more likely to have more factors that negatively affect his mental health, possibly isolation. He might have experienced trauma, be smoking, experiencing financial instability. That in turn decreases the size of his container, which in turn increases his vulnerability to developing a mental health issue. Now, we all have a maximum capacity for stress, and that is very individual and unique to each and every one of us. So again, it would seem that Bob has a larger stress container and Frank a smaller stress container. Now, stress flows into the container. Okay, we have everyday stresses. We know that we accept stress as a part of everyday life, and our stress container might start to fill with issues from work, from home, from relationships, from a leaky roof, from physical illness. We know that stress comes from all sorts of places. We do lead complex lives after all. And as that stress container starts to fill and starts to fill, there is a point when it can start to overflow. And when our stress container starts to overflow, that is when problems can develop. That is when we might start to notice a change in ourselves or in others. And we call it a stress signature, or we call it emotional snapping. And this can look different to different people. But when the stress container overflows and overflows for too long, that is when a mental health issue can be triggered. So there is a whole body of research that tells us that mental health issues are often triggered by too much stress for too long. So again, with Bob and Frank experiencing the same amount of stress, Bob is coping with stress. He has a larger stress container, so he's not overflowing. Frank, however, has a smaller stress container, so much more quickly overflows, and we see his stress signature of feelings of not being able to cope, irritability, not sleeping, the suppressed appetite, not being able to make decisions. Now, for ourselves, we can reflect and think about our own stress signature to help ourselves. And for some of us, this might be having difficulty getting to sleep. It might be becoming irritable. For some of us, it might be becoming much more quiet, tearful, angry, a change in eating habits. We all respond to stress and overwhelm differently. But if we can identify those stress signatures as early as possible, we can help ourselves not to overflow, or not to overflow for a long period of time. And indeed, we might also tell others about our stress signature so they can help us to identify it. Sometimes when we're in the eye of the storm, we can't necessarily see it for ourselves. So by sharing that with someone that we trust, or a few people that we trust, to have that supportive conversation, that can be really helpful. And it's so important not to ignore the overflow. There is a need to face into it, or there is potentially a risk of mental health issues developing later on. Now, on our stress container, we do have a tap, and that tap represents our coping strategies. Now, helpful strategies: open the tap and let the stress out. So the stress dissipates down the container and flows out of the tap in a healthy way. But we might also have unhelpful coping mechanisms that we use from time to time. And over a longer period of time, the tap can block the container fill and it starts to overflow. In terms of examples of ways that we can manage our stress in the moment, open that tap up. Thinking about taking moderate exercise, fantastic way of dealing with stress. Talking about those things that are causing us stress, so again, sharing with people we trust. Getting good sleep and eating well, so thinking about how we nourish our bodies through sleep, through a nourishing diet, reducing caffeine. We can use breathing and relaxation techniques, doing things that we enjoy like reading and yoga. Unhelpful coping strategies might be things like smoking, drinking too much alcohol, using drugs, isolating ourselves from others, ignoring the issue, burying our head in the sand, hoping it will go away, dwell on the negative, eating too much fast food. As a reminder, some stress is good for us. Actually, some stress is great for us. We get that drive, we get that motivation. If we have a deadline, we get that drive to meet that deadline. But then too much for too long can lead to problems. And what is too much varies from person to person. So if we have too much workload to get to a deadline, if we have too many deadlines, too much going on at once, that can start to become unhelpful. So for ourselves, we can use this tool to identify what's in our stress containers, so we can capture those down, identify what we can take action on, so what's in our control, what can we immediately take action on, what are those priorities, reflect on what is completely out of our control, accept and let go. We can try to identify early warning signs of too much stress, so we can take a step back. We can also consider our taps, as well as building more factors into our lives that positively influence our mental health. And that in turn can support us to build bigger containers, reducing our vulnerability to developing an issue. Now, over the last year, we can start to see how more mental health issues have arisen. Firstly, we've not necessarily had access to our usual helpful coping mechanisms, things like going to the gym, being active in team sports, meeting up with friends. So our taps have possibly been fewer. The last 12 to 15 months have caused stress for a lot of people, the change and uncertainty. So that's caused more stress going into our containers. And we've also been presented with factors that can negatively influence our mental health. So things like social isolation, physical health issues, all the change and uncertainty over a long period of time, all of which can cause our stress containers to become smaller and therefore quicker to overflow. So this is one tool that we can use to proactively manage our stress, and not just in times where we're feeling overwhelmed, but actually we can reflect on this every month, every quarter, whatever feels right for us, and also can be a fantastic talking tool for helping and supporting others as well. Now, this does bring me on to the next concept, which is the circle of concern, influence, and control. And we can use this to help us deal with the stresses in our lives and support us in feeling resilient. Now, I just briefly mentioned about identifying stresses that are in our control and that we can take action on, reflect on what is completely out of our control, accept and let go. And this model is really supportive in helping us to do that. It's common for us to have many worries, concerns and stresses. When we look at the things within our circle of concern, we can see that there are some things over which we have no real control and others that we can do something about. So introducing you to the circle of concern then, which is our first circle here. Now, the outside circle is the circle of concern. It is also known as the circle of no control. This encompasses the wide range of circumstances, issues, problems that we have, but over which we have no real control. This includes problems we can do nothing about, such as our past or situational realities, and it's the biggest circle because there are so many things that we have no power to change. Now, if we put our time and energy into worrying about the things that are in our circle of concern, we will continue to feel out of control and helpless and stressed, and that is a whole lot of energy wasted. So things that might sit in our circle of concern are things like government policy, Brexit, wherever we're situated, that might not impact us, but it might impact others. Legislation changes, what's being reported in the media or on social media, economy, and so on and so forth. So we might have concerns about these. And if we can keep being concerned about these, where we don't have control, where we don't have influence, actually that can start to be unhelpful and cause us that chronic stress. Now we have a middle circle. Okay, so moving on from our circle of concern, we're going to move to the middle circle, which is our circle of influence. Okay, so our circle of influence encompasses the circumstances, issues, and problems that we have indirect control over. So this includes problems involving other people's behaviour. We can't directly control them, but there's a good chance that we can have an impact or influence on them by our own actions and choices. For example, if we have a friend who is eating a donut, we might try to influence them into eating a piece of fruit instead as a healthier option. But we don't have control over whether our friend eats the piece of fruit. They may well eat the donut. Indeed, if someone is standing too close to us, we may ask them politely to move away. We might try to influence, but we can't necessarily control the outcome. So we can't control the person's behaviour. And there may also be a time where we can't influence it either if somebody refuses to move, in which case we can think about our attitude towards the situation. Now, if we put our time and energy into our circle of influence more than our circle of concern, we will feel more in control. The circle of influence is really important because it's here that we are able to change our habits, our behaviours, thinking, change our methods of influence, or change our attitude towards the problems over which we have no control, where we accept the problems and learn to live with them, even though we don't like them. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change how we look at it. Okay, and then our inner circle. So the inner circle is our circle of control. This encompasses those circumstances, issues, problems that we have direct control over. And this includes problems involving our own behaviour and thoughts. We don't necessarily have the power to control all of our thoughts that come into our minds, but we have the power to choose whether we allow them to stay, whether we allow them to linger or let them go. For some people, the time we go to bed and what we eat may be things that are in our control. So the choices we make about nourishing food, the choices we make about sleep hygiene. But for others, so maybe children or elderly people living in care homes, the time they go to bed and what they eat is possibly out of their control. So again, situations, context is really important. If we're a spectator at a sports match, it's out of our control. But if we're an umpire, we can influence the sports match by controlling how the game is played. If we're not involved in politics, then government policy is out of our control. But if we're a politician, then we can influence government policy. If we put our time and energy into our circle of influence and our circle of control, we will give ourselves a sense of agency and feel more in control. So this is really where we need to focus our time and energy. So how can we use this to help ourselves? This is a really fantastic exercise. As an individual or team, you can use this tool to explore your worries, your concerns, your stresses that you might have noted down. And it's really, really simple. So starting by drawing 3 circles. So exactly in the image, draw a circle of concern, influence, and control. Then on small sticky notes or pieces of paper, write down separately all the circumstances, issues, problems that are bothering you and put them into the circle of concern. So putting them into the largest circle. And at this stage, you may have a look at them and think, oh my goodness, I'm feeling stressed and anxious about all of these things that I've written down. And you may feel you don't have any control over them. And having no control can be alarming. But we can take a look at all those things we've written down, decide which things we can actively control. And when we've identified those things that we can control, we can move those sticky notes or pieces of paper directly into the middle, into the smaller circle of control. Now, at this point, you may think that there aren't many items that you can actively control, and maybe that's true. But if you can't control them, ask yourself, can I influence them? So think about ways you might be able to influence the things that are still in your circle of concern. For example, could you develop a better relationship with the person outside of the team who's making impossible demands and get to the root cause of their behaviour? So you could go through all the notes that are still in your circle of concern and try to move them into the circle of influence. And as you explore these further and think differently about them, so again, thinking about our natural behaviours, our natural thinking processes, and challenging those, we can try to move them into the circle of influence. And potentially straight into the circle of control. Now, you can have this up in your work environment as a reminder of how much you can control and where you need to focus your energy and time to reduce those feelings of stress. So in short, the circles of control, influence and concern model reminds you that if you can't control it, don't get stressed about it. If you can't influence it, don't get upset about it. Focus on what you can change, not on what you can't change. Okay, and so moving through to my final 5 tips to reduce stress, raise energy, and improve mental well-being. First of all, looking after our physical health. Looking after our physical health, our physical wellness. So again, if we think back to those 8 dimensions of wellness, looking after our physical wellness is a fantastic way of boosting and maintaining our sense of overall well-being and mental health. Being physically active doesn't necessarily mean you have to do a 10K run, go to the gym and lift weights. It can be doing things like gardening, yoga, dancing around your kitchen. Now, physical activity releases endorphins that make us feel good. So it gives us a natural boost, gives us something to focus on, gives us a sense of achievement, can be social depending on the activity chosen, reduces inflammation in the body, builds new neurological pathways to feeling happier, and we are more likely to sleep well after physical exertion, all of which is vital to our overall health. We can also look after our physical health by considering how we nourish our bodies. So we can do that through sleep. Having good sleep hygiene, a regular sleep pattern. Now, deep restorative sleep is deeply personal, so we might go through trial and error before finding a routine that works for us. But the common foundations for healthy sleep are things like aiming for 8 hours of sleep a night. Most adults function best with around 8 hours of sleep. Bringing back the bedtime. So quite commonly we have bedtime for our children, but do we have it for ourselves? A regular sleep schedule often helps us to get in sync with our natural circadian rhythms, and a consistent morning wake time may be even more important in aligning our sleep with our kind of daily cycle. Let the light in. Exposure to natural light during the day keeps melatonin, so the hormone that regulates sleep, aligned with our sleep cycle. Doing things like staying away from screens. So television, computer or backlit devices, screens can suppress melatonin, that hormone that we need for sleep. So it's recommended to avoid devices at night or around bedtime, usually at least for 1 hour before going to bed. And temperature as well. So aiming for 20 degrees. If it's too hot, too cold, that's going to interfere with our sleep. Thinking about, our bodies during the day. So avoid eating big meals and drinking lots of liquids before bed, as they can keep us awake, can wake us up in the middle of the night. And establishing boundaries as well, that our beds are for sleeping. If we're on our phones in bed, if we're on our laptops in bed, that can send the wrong message to our brains when it's time to wind down. We can also think about the nutrition and eating a balanced diet to support our physical health and well-being, to really reduce stress, raise our energy, improve our well-being. And quite commonly in times of stress, what happens in our bodies is we experience a sugar spike in our bloodstreams, and then that kind of dissipates and go away. And then we want to reach out for those sugary foods. That's very natural, that's very normal, but rather than reaching out for that cookie or that biscuit, we can consider a more nutritious option like a piece of fruit. Thinking about hydration as well, that is so important for our energy. Our brains are something like 80% fat and water. So if we're dehydrated, we're going to feel low. We're going to experience stress. We're going to be much more quick to emotions. So on balance, on average, women should be drinking about 2 to 3 litres of water a day and men 3 to 4 litres of water a day. And reducing caffeine, nicotine and alcohol intake as well. Our physical health is also thinking about our work environment. If our physical work environment is disorganised and chaotic, it's likely to cause feelings of overwhelm. So we can think about that. We can think about having a tidy workspace, a tidy mind. Now, if our workstation setup is good, we can aim to stretch our bodies and move every 25 minutes. So even if we have a great workstation setup, it is recommended to move every 25 minutes. And if it's less than ideal, then every 15 minutes. And by doing this, we prevent aches, pains, niggles that can start to become a problem over the longer term, and that can cause us to feel stressed. It's also important to think about having about 5 minutes rest from our screens every hour or so. We do start to experience eye fatigue and tiredness. So 5 minutes away from our screens. And it's also about resting. We can't always be on the go. So looking after our physical health is also about stopping, taking time out, taking breaks, making the most of our weekends to really have some downtime. My second tip to reduce stress, raise energy and improve mental well-being. It's about using social connections and having good relationships. Social connectedness is central to our sense of well-being. When we feel lonely and isolated, we can start to feel stressed. We can start to see a shift in our mood and our feelings. And some research suggests that isolation is as damaging to our health as smoking can be. So keep in touch with family, friends, colleagues, others, reconnect with old acquaintances. As we do that, we are going to build that resilience as well, so that can support us in dealing with stressful life events. We are accustomed to social interaction. It's absolutely imperative to our sense of well-being. Now, if we live alone, then we may need to be more proactive with this. If we live in a busy household, actually, we might need to recognise, I need a bit of space. Let's remember we're all individuals. Not everything will work for everyone. It will be about thinking about your own needs and circumstances and trying out what you think will work for you. And with that, consider who you can talk to if you are dealing with stress or other difficult feelings and emotions. If we're regularly in contact with our social connections, with people that we trust, we may be more ready to talk about what's going on in our lives and ask for help. It is common for people to bottle feelings up, but that can quite quickly start to become unhelpful, cause us more stress and anxiety. Also be aware of what other supports might be available to you locally, through work, whatever that might be. Thirdly, routine and structure. Creating a routine can be hugely beneficial to us. By doing this, we can start to build in self-care practices into our routine, which become helpful habits, all of which can reduce stress, improve our energy and our mental well-being. So better stress levels naturally lead to improved health, more time to relax and less anxiety. And routines give us a sense of certainty and control to our lives. So small things like getting up at the same time every day and going to bed at the same time every day gives us a sense of certainty in our lives where we feel actually a lot of things are uncertain. Better sleep will leave us refreshed, so our daily routines influences the quality of our rest. And our sleep schedule and bedtime habits affect our mental sharpness, our performance, our emotional well-being and energy levels. Again, it's all intertwined. So it's best if we can maintain a consistent time for waking up and going to bed. The more regularly we get up at the same time and go to bed at the same time, the body adjusts and starts to learn when it's time for getting up and resting for bed. And routine and structure generally results in better health. So with just a little bit of extra planning, so we can set our alarms at the same time each and every day, whether we're working in the office or whether we're working remotely, depending what those situations are. I'm not going to make any assumptions about what your circumstances are, but a lot of people over the last year have been building commutes into their daily schedules where they haven't been going into the office to try and Prevent the blurred lines between work and home. A lot of us have been missing out on that transition between home and work. That has certainly become blurred. So if our commute would ordinarily be something like 30 minutes, we can think about that time for ourselves in the morning. That might be by doing some reading, going for a walk, meditating, sitting in the garden with a cup of tea. We can build that self-care practice into our commute, into our routine. And with that, by creating a routine, we can build that rest and self-care time. And again, that's going to reduce our stress, raise our energy, improve our mental well-being. So we can commit to it by setting a chunk of time in our diaries for lunch and breaks. It's so easy for us to get stuck to our desks and work through breaks and lunch, when in fact studies show that if we take time out for ourselves, we are more likely to be productive, focused, sharp, less tired, because our mind is able to rest, recharge, and focus. No breaks means more stress, lower mood, tired, reduces creativity. We start to get decision fatigue, and over the long term, we can start to see things like burnout, increased stress, and anxiety. So it's important that we do this properly. If we are taking a break, getting away from our desk, having a good chunk of time to eat good food and keep hydrated, taking a walk, getting those breaks in the diary. And it's the same at the end of the day as well. Have a diary note set in for when you're going to finish work, as well as me time. If your finish time is 6 p.m, put it in your diary that after 6 p.m, this is me time. Again, it's so easy for us to say, I'm just going to finish this off. And then we end up spending another hour or two logged on, eating into our evenings, our downtime, our personal time. Over the long term, this can be detrimental. And ultimately, the lines start to blur once again between work and home life. And that balance becomes imbalanced. Remember, there is more to us than work. Yes, we have professional lives, but we also have personal lives. And if we finish work on time, we will get enough rest before the next working day, and then we will be on form. A lack of rest or enjoyment in our personal lives can cause more stress and less productivity. And lastly, if we commit to finishing work on time each day, it pushes us to think more carefully about how we plan our time and prioritise our work activities. And technically, that could mean we actually achieve the same, if not more, because we are focused on our time and how we spend it. And therefore, we can be more productive. We can chunk activities, think about the meetings we participate in. And does it have to be an hour-long meeting? Can we shave it to 50 minutes so we can promote that 10-minute break in between, or rather than 30 minutes, make it 25 minutes instead. So there is a lot to be said about routine and structure, in its simplicity, but actually, those healthy habits are so important. Rest, self-care practices, all of which will help to reduce stress, raise our energy, and improve our mental well-being. Practicing gratitude is my next top tip. We can acknowledge the goodness in our lives, and that at least tends to be partially outside of ourselves. And that can help us to feel greater, connected to something larger than ourselves, something greater, like nature, people, the universe, or a higher power. Gratitude is strongly and consistently associated with greater happiness, reduced stress and anxiety, and we feel more positive emotions, relish good experiences, improve our health, deal with adversity, and build strong relationships. And we can practice gratitude in many ways, looking at our past and retrieving positive memories, looking at our present and what's currently good, as well as the future by maintaining a hopeful and optimistic outlook. This is a way for us to appreciate what we have, rather than always reaching for something new in the hope that it will make us feel happier. We can look for what's good instead of being caught up on the things we don't have. And there are many ways that we can do this, and it can be really, really easy. Thanking someone mentally. Thanking somebody in our head for a good deed that they've done, or indeed we might write them a thank you note. Reflecting on our day and the things that you're grateful for having happened. And again, that could be mentally, or you could write it down. You might write a journal. Some people use prayer as a way to practice gratitude. Or at the end of each week, it might be taking time to write down 3 things that went well or that you're grateful for, being specific about how you felt at that time as well. And being kind to ourselves, but also being kind to others. Evidence shows that helping others can benefit our mental health and well-being. For example, it can reduce stress as well as improve our mood, self-esteem and happiness. And there are so many ways to help others as part of our everyday lives. Good deeds don't need to take a lot of time or cost any money. So small changes make a big difference. Random acts of kindness, putting the bins out for a neighbour. Could be volunteering, doing something for a good cause, smiling at someone, paying somebody a compliment. All of these small things can really boost our well-being. And to ourselves, I really think this is one of the best things that we can do for ourselves, to be kind, practice self-compassion, and do the things that we enjoy. Now, I'd like to ask you a question and ask you to reflect and think about a time when you felt low, sad, anxious, when something didn't go quite right. And think about how you spoke to yourself at that time. What did your inner voice say to you? And think about a time where a friend shared with you, a time where they were sad, anxious, something didn't go well, something didn't go as planned. And think about how you spoke to them. When you think about those two scenarios, was the way you spoke to yourself the same as you spoke to your friend, or was it different? Now, most of us are quite self-critical. And if we're self-critical and we have that negative internal voice, it's likely to cause feelings of stress and anxiety. Self-compassion, being kind to ourselves, it's all about learning to treat ourselves as we would a friend. Rather than beating ourselves up, we can be kind and understanding. It does take practice, but the sooner we can challenge that internal critical voice, the better. We can also be kind to ourselves by not trying to do everything and be everything to everybody. That's only going to cause us stress and possibly make us feel exhausted. Lower expectations of yourself. Don't compare yourself to others. Sometimes we need to do nothing. And do something you enjoy. Have fun. Dance around the kitchen. Be silly. Laughter is the best medicine, they say. Our brain truly switches off when we laugh, and we can feel the effects for up to an hour. That can reduce our stress, raise our energy, and improve our mental well-being. Doing things we enjoy, reading a book, having a bubble bath, meditating, whatever that thing is, make time for it. Proactively choose to take that action. It doesn't happen by itself. So we need to make that time. We need to find that time to really prioritize ourselves. Thank you. So to recap, in this session, we have covered why is our mental health so important, looking at how we define that we all have mental health, and the 8 dimensions of wellness that contribute to our overall well-being. We've explored stress and its relationship with mental health, looking at the stress container model, the circle of concern, influence and control as a way of managing our stress. And also there's a piece around self-awareness and identifying as early as possible some of these issues so we can help ourselves early. And then closing on 5 tips for reducing your stress, raising your energy and improving your mental well-being. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Hi, Sally. I've got a couple that came in as you were speaking, but please, any of you out there, by all means, ask any more questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them once we finish these ones. First one relates to your stress container model, asking whether you can increase its capacity over time.
Yes, indeed. So we have lots of different factors that influence our mental health, and our stress containers are not fixed in size. So we might have a general capacity for stress, but if, for example, we get 3 nights of bad sleep, our stress containers are probably going to feel a bit smaller. We might not be able to deal with things as well as we might ordinarily because of that lack of sleep, and that can, impact our mental health. Equally, yes, over time, if we are regularly practicing things that are good for us, like self-care, practicing gratitude, doing the things we enjoy, using our coping skills. So in times of stress, if we exercise to help ourselves, actually doing that regularly all the time, not just waiting for those moments of stress, we start to build a reserve. We start to grow those stress containers to be more resilient. So absolutely, thinking about the coping skills, communication skills, we might learn how to prioritize and organize, delegate. All of that can really support ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you, Sally. And I know you talked about good and bad screen workstation setup. Can you give some examples of either of those?
good and bad workstation setups?
Yeah, you mentioned it
Yeah.
earlier on, didn't you?
Sure. So having a dedicated workspace, that's really important, where you can kind of separate your workspace from your home space, but also making sure in terms of physically, your monitors are at the right level, meeting all those health and safety things, making sure your chair is ergonomically safe for you. A year ago, when we very first went into lockdown, people were having to be really creative with their workspaces, with kind of, yes, I've got a table, but I'm going to have to use a box, and I've got lots of cushions and things like that. That's not going to be ideal. So it's that ergonomic safety to promote that physical well-being, which will ultimately impact how we are able to engage and how we can be productive too. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes. Next one is, any tips on managing self-talk, particularly when you don't manage to complete your routine due to not being disciplined enough with leaving work, etc.? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but can you repeat it for me?
Oh, sorry. Any tips on managing self-talk, particularly when you don't manage to complete your routine due to not being disciplined enough with leaving work, etc.?
Okay, so with our self-talk, naturally we are quite self-critical, and I think for a lot of us, we say things like, I should have finished work on time, I should have done this, and should is a bit of a dangerous word. I think we can change that to could. I could have finished work on time, but I didn't today, and I'm going to try and do better tomorrow, or something like that. So that self-talk maybe change from should to could. It is difficult being disciplined, but I'd say also take it step by step. Don't try to do too much at once. So if you are trying to think about, work-life balance, you can take your first step by, putting a lunch hour in your diary every day, 12 till 1, and really committing to that. And we can commit ourselves more to that by telling others, okay, guys, I'm taking my lunch from 12 till 1, and we're more likely to do that. So it's about trying and testing these different ways. I wouldn't try to do everything at once, but try something now and again. Let's use language could rather than should, and try to start building those self-care practices. Again, it can take time. It's not always straightforward. We might feel like we're making really good progress and then have a week where it's all gone to pot. That's absolutely normal. But let's be kind to ourselves in those situations, because we're only going to cause ourselves more stress and anxiety if we have that unhelpful inner self-talk.
Excellent, thank you. Next one, how would you recommend us to deal with toxic relationships which cause stress problem to mental well-being? I think it's and problems to mental well-being.
That's a really great question, and probably quite a difficult one to answer without the context. How to deal with toxic relationships. I mean, it's a really great question, and I think about that kind of circle of concern, influence, and control. How are we able to influence that relationship in some way, shape, or form by sitting down with someone? I guess, is this a work relationship? Is this a personal relationship? Those have different dynamics. But thinking about, are we able to influence that relationship? Are we able to engage in those conversations where we can really talk about our feelings and how that relationship impacts us? Without knowing the context, it's probably a little bit difficult to answer, but I'd probably think about how we can influence the relationship. And if we feel like we can't influence that relationship, is there a point of acceptance? And this feels really uncomfortable. I really don't like this, but I've tried to influence. I've thought about different ways of influencing, and we're not moving forward. So does that go into my circle of concern? And if it goes into my circle of concern, then when we think back to those post-it notes, anything that remains in that circle of concern, turn those upside down and focus on what you can influence and what you can control.
Excellent, thank you, Sally. And the next one, how do you identify if you're under stress, or your container is overflowing? This is so as to ensure you don't develop mental health issues.
So I think this is a self-awareness piece here. So identifying what might be our triggers. So for example, I know for me, when I start overworking, that's a sign of stress, and then overworking causes me stress as well. So that's taken me time to work that out, though. It was only when I started to become unwell that I picked up on that. So there is a bit about self-awareness, trying to pick up on changes in terms of, are there changes to how I'm sleeping? So think about what your normal is, and when we're not at capacity, when we're not overflowing, we can stop and reflect back maybe times where we have felt stressed and thought, well, what was I like at the time? What was my thinking? What were my feelings? What were my behaviours? How did my interactions change? So if you can get those down when you're not in it, when it starts to come to that, when we start to notice those changes, perhaps we can identify those earlier on before an issue really starts to develop over the long term.
Excellent. And I think the last one I have here at the moment is, what is the link between mental health and resilience?
Mental health and resilience. Great question. So the link between mental health and resilience. So resilience is about our ability to bounce back. It's about how we regulate our emotions. It's about how we face challenges, or whether we see challenges as opportunities or whether we see challenges as threats. Now, if we have strong resilience where we can face into things, where we can bounce back, so we see, or for example, we start our day, I'm feeling 8 out of 10, so I'm feeling pretty good. I have a really difficult client conversation. Oh, now I feel like I'm a 5 out of 10. Oh, so I've shifted. Resilience is, what can I do to support myself in moving back up to that 8 to support my mental health? And that might be using a helpful coping mechanism like going out for a walk, talking about it, having a vent, doing some meditation. So that's how it fits in. It's about bouncing back from those setbacks to support our sense of well-being. So resilience is it's not a coping mechanism, it's an approach. It's a skill we can use to support our sense of well-being and mental health.
Thank you, Sally. That's excellent. Thank you for answering those questions. Is there anything you want to add before we sort of move on to the next little bit?
No, I don't think so. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sally. Thank you for everyone for attending the webinar. What we'd also like you to do, if possible, is to give us some feedback. There's going to be a link in the chat box for a SurveyMonkey feedback form. If you could take this link and complete any feedback, that would be most appreciated. Just gives us an idea of what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and where we can go and improve on and any of the next webinars that we do. So it'd be most helpful if you could do that. And as you can see on the screen, we have an offer on our mental health awareness courses to coincide with Mental Health Awareness Week, which finishes this week. So the offer is valid until the end of next week, with the code you can see on the screen there. So you get 50% off any mental health awareness courses if you've previously booked or intend to book one of our other courses of the value of £500 or more. So as you can see, we have the 3 courses running in June and September: mental health awareness, mental health first aid, and mental health first aid again in September. So please feel free to take the code down. Please feel free to go on the website. As you can see, you can go and look at it on our website. And I'd like to thank you all for attending and say goodbye.